In 1978, General Motors would downsize its intermediate cars, the so-called A-bodies, 1 year after it overhauled and downsized its full-size cars. These A-bodies were lighter and shorter than they were before, and if I'm honest, they also had reduced quality, let's say. The fit and finish and the materials were not that great on this next generation of A-bodies, and I don't think that they looked as good as the previous generation vehicles either. For instance, this 1978 Regal that you see here, the inaugural year of this downsized Regal, it just doesn't quite look right. And I think that GM engineers and product planners were trying to save a few dollars, so they only had this single headlight on either side as opposed to the dual headlamps on either side. And in general, the material quality wasn't all that great. Regardless, while the material quality might not have been that great, these cars actually were decent sellers. In the first couple years, they were a little bit more sluggish than the previous generation models, but they lasted a long time, all the way through for the Regal till the 1987 model year. And then in 1988, the new W-body front-wheel drive Regal would come out, and that would largely put a punctuation mark on the transition that Buick had begun in the early 1980s of moving its vehicles to front-wheel drive. In fact, while these cars, the rear-wheel drive cars, were designated as A-bodies when they were announced in 1978, all the way through the 1981 model year, in 1982, GM changed the nomenclature for this body and called it the G-body, simply because the new A-bodies were being introduced that were front-wheel drive. My guess is that the anachronistic, or by now anachronistic, G platform was not supposed to last this long, and GM was really big on front-wheel drive and transitioning almost every passenger car to front-wheel drive. In fact, there was supposed to be a front-wheel drive B-body vehicle that would replace the B-body rear-wheel drive architecture, but for whatever reason, it continued to soldier on for years after the rest of the lineup transitioned to front-wheel drive. Well, that's probably in large part due to the fact that these programs were engineered at a time when program planners thought that gasoline was going to be the modern-day equivalent of $5 to $6 per gallon, and so getting efficient vehicles was a highly important item for engineers, and frankly, some of it was mandated too by corporate average fuel economy standards, which GM had to have a fleet-wide average of 27.5 miles per gallon by the late 80s, so that forced them also into making more efficient vehicles. Regardless, today we are going to look at the ultimate year for the G-body at the Buick side of the house. That is this 1987 Buick Regal Limited. Now, as you can see here, the front end by 1987 had the quad headlamps, and in fact, the single headlamp on either side was a rather brief design theme on these Regals. Just 1978 and 1979 before in 1980, the car would get those quad headlamps. It made it look so much better. Again, those single headlamps, I think, just made it look cheap, but GM must have had a mandate for a while to have everything have one headlamp on either side, because even the front-wheel drive Cavalier, as an example, had the single headlamp, and then shortly thereafter went to the quad headlamp setup. It just, I don't know what was going on with GM during that time frame. In any case, you have the Buick trademark waterfall grille, something that would be a Buick kind of symbol of design all the way back many, many years, decades, in particular to the 1940s era. But here reinterpreted with a lot thinner bars and quite a few, let's say a lot more vertical bars as well. You also notice that there's quite the rise on those fenders. It's a relatively low front end and a low nose, and then rising up to the cowl, and then a relatively flat belt line thereafter, and a slight taper to the rear. These were the last vehicles, or close to the last vehicles, of General Motors styling vice president Bill Mitchell, and still kind of exemplifies some of his style, particularly in that tapered deck lid. Of course, by 1987, Bill Mitchell had retired, Irv Ribicki, his successor, had retired, and now Chuck Jordan was in charge of General Motors design. But these vehicles, particularly the 78 Regal, were still designed under the Bill Mitchell era. Now, one other thing I'll point out is you notice in this photo that the paint doesn't quite match between the fender and the door. And I suspect that that is actually factory. And you're saying, factory? How can the paint not match from the factory? Well, these vehicles were one of the last ones that Fisher Body Division would produce the body, which meant that they were responsible for the exterior paint as well as the interior trim and finish of all of the interior componentry. And then the bodies would be shipped to the assembly plant where they would be dropped on the frame. And then the assembly plant and the car division was responsible for painting the fenders as well as the front clip, including the hood, and assembling the car together. So the fenders and the hood were, in some cases on these cars, painted in different facilities, or it would be painted in a different paint shop under the same roof. Some assembly plants even had a line in the floor that said where Fisher Body Division ended and the divisional operations began. So that's the reason why this is different. And here's a different car, but I thought I would just show the front end because these waterfall style grills were really popular with General Motors designers among this time. The 76 Olds Cutlass, as an example, had one of the first, I'll say, very distinctive waterfall grills from General Motors. Of course, the 74 Imperial also had one. But here you've got kind of an inverse waterfall grill that spills into the bumper as opposed to into the header panel. And there's even, you can see the chrome trim of the bumper has a cutout section where this waterfall grill kind of takes over. So, it's a good-looking grill, good-looking theme. Kind of have an overall S theme to this front end from the side profile. So a handsome look, probably one of the reasons why this Regal kept selling very, very well all the way through to 1987. Still sold about 100,000 units in its last year, despite the fact that the car was, relatively old. So people still wanted something that was rear-wheel drive and good looking and a coupe. And of course, there was the Grand National and GNX variants of this. But even the standard Regals were, like I said, good sellers. Now here we have a relatively flat belt line, as I was mentioning before. The big, I hesitate to even call it an opera window because it's so big. But that was started really with the 71 Eldorado on General Motors cars and the 73 Monte Carlo. And then it started proliferating across the lineup and became a popular visual cue back when designers thought that they had to have a relatively thick B-pillar for rollover standards, and they couldn't have the hardtop styling anymore. So that window has grown here and is quite large. Notice the A-pillar, though, is still very toothpicky. Interesting wheel arches on this car that are shown off by this silver color and the lighting that you can see here, where they kind of get fatter as they go rearward. So I think that's a nice distinctive look. One thing that's lost in this car, maybe because of the 108.1-inch wheelbase, is the dash-to-axle proportion. There's not a lot of dash-to-axle here, as opposed to some other GM cars that the front wheels were pushed further forward. Perfect example would be like the 1969 Grand Prix. So this one doesn't have that great of a stance, I would say. In fact, the body and the overhangs themselves look too big, at least visually in this side profile. I think this is the worst profile for the G-body vehicles because the wheelbase at 108 inches just doesn't look big enough. You almost want to push the wheels further out to the corners, and you want some more dash-to-axle, but that's not what the platform allowed. You can also see here that this car has a tapered front and rear, which, again, was something that Bill Mitchell loved, the tapering of both ends in some cases. Sometimes you only saw tapered rears. Sometimes you only saw tapered fronts. Here you got the tapered front and rear for the vehicle. And now as we rotate around to this rear three-quarter view, you can see the Buick signature wall-to-wall tail lamps that had started back in the early 1960s and became a Buick hallmark for many, many years. Even on the front-wheel drive cars like the 1985 C-Body Electra, it had the wall-to-wall tail lights. So it's something that at least tied the cars together. I think the roof lines also candidly tied the cars together. The very formal style C-pillar that you see here, the upright C-pillar, something that the front-wheel drive cars would have when they were introduced as well. As opposed to Ford when they introduced the Taurus, as an example, in 1986, with a completely different style from the rear-wheel drive, say the Panther platform and Fox body cars, GM actually tried to incorporate a lot of that rear-wheel drive type style into the front-wheel drive cars, at least in terms of the three-box design with the formal C-pillars that harken back to that 76 to 79 Seville. You do see here that there is a pretty wide rocker molding in the midsection of the car. Interestingly, no rocker molding on the front or the rear. And I don't know, I think it looks a little bit strange here. Notice that the sheet metal, the fender, the front end of the fender, the lower portion is aligned with the top of the brightwork for the rocker molding. You almost want it to come down further and have the rocker molding covering it up. Maybe that was a cost savings move to not have that sheet metal for the fender, because the rocker molding really serves to visually slim the car in addition to dress it up from a view like this or the side view that we saw before. But you don't have to slim it up if you don't have the sheet metal. So I wonder if that was something that was part of the thought process. And notice, just like the front and the rear, you kind of have a little bit of that waterfall-like shape to the rear, although the deck lid has a concave surface just underneath its uppermost portion. You can see that's casting a little bit of a shadow on what otherwise is a highlighted deck lid given the light source here. But you've got a similar type of style to the front, and that just shows how designers were trying to tie the front and the rear themes together. And in the dead-on rear view, you can see that the bumper has this little dip section in the middle, kind of scalloped out to make way for the license plate. These cars you did, by the way, also still fuel them from the rear. Interestingly, on those front-wheel drive C and H body cars that I mentioned, the Electra, the LeSabre, you'd have similar tail lamps, but the plate would be a drop-in plate. You didn't have to put any screws. You just pop the trunk, and then there was a little provision for where you would put the license plate in, and it would slide right in. A great idea. I have not seen a car before or since have a drop-in plate, but that was very functional and very convenient. Didn't even have to worry about theft, really, in that case, and didn't have to worry about attaching screws. That had not come here by the time that this rear-wheel drive Regal was produced. By the way, you can see that concave filleted section at the top, again, given the light source, is creating that low light on this particular vehicle as well, to give the deck a little bit of dimension and to slim it as well from a vertical height dimension. Now, as we transition to the interior, this is an interestingly equipped limited Regal. It has crank windows, as you can see, so somebody didn't want power windows. It does have a center console, interestingly, and bucket seats. So, yeah, you think it's kind of sporty until we get under the hood where, well, this does not have the optional 5-liter Olds 307 V8. It just has the 3.8-liter engine from Buick under hood. In any case, you see the loose cushion style seat design up top. Interestingly, no loose cushion on the bottom. GM rarely had the true loose cushion on the bottom. I don't know if it was for cost, for wear, for both. You often just saw the real loose cushion on the top. Chrysler, as an example, would have the loose cushion on the top and the bottom of their seats. But regardless, this loose cushion style design was really pioneered back in the 1972 Oldsmobile 98 Regency. That was where it first appeared for GM vehicles. And then I think customers liked it so much that it found its way into many different interiors. And really, you'd find it on a lot of Oldsmobiles, Buicks, and even some Cadillacs, particularly the D'Elegance DeVilles, as an example, or the Eldorado Biarritzes. Those kind of cars tended to have this style of interior. Now, by this point, General Motors was starting to use a lot of common componentry in its vehicles, including the multifunction turn signal. This car doesn't have cruise control either. Can't quite see if it has delay wipers or not. I can't make out the markings on that multifunction stalk, but some people hate it. I actually thought it worked well. The design of it was good. The only thing about that multifunction stalk was it never had a very positive feel when it was engaging the turn signal. Always felt like you were going to kind of break it off, and it made a very plasticky click. But from a functionality perspective, I think it worked. Then you have the light switch on the dash, which was common by this point. The HVAC controls, common. The radio, common. Really across the entire lineup, from Chevrolet to Cadillac, although Cadillac, at least for the climate control, would have, I would say, automatic climate control. The headlamp switch would be a little bit different, but they tended to share radios. So GM was starting to use more and more common componentry, which I would guess that the designers didn't necessarily like, because now you can't really give individual flair to the radio, as an example. You're just forced to use a common unit. But, oh well, that's how it is. And then this kind of droopy two-spoke steering wheel. Not quite sure why the Regal got this logo, this blue logo with the slash in between it. I'm not sure what that was supposed to connote, but it picked that up along the way too. And you have a very vertically oriented dash. All the vents are vertically oriented, relatively tall IP. Notice that in front of the passenger, that section is pushed forward to give you the kind of feeling of more room and openness and airiness, but the radio and HVAC controls are pulled rearward so that the reach envelope, when you're sitting in the seat, you can reach them easily, more readily. And then, of course, the driver's section with the speedometer and the various elements there is pulled forward to, make it, I guess, more driver-centric. So little tricks of the trade for the interior, and ergonomics was starting to become a more important thing at GM and other automakers during this time, and I suspect that's one of the reasons why that HVAC setup as well as the radio are pulled rearward. Now, in the underhood department, unfortunately, this Regal doesn't really have anything exciting. It's got the standard 3.8-liter V6 engine, made 110 horsepower, 190 pound-feet of torque. Not a lot for a big car like this during the era. This is the pre-balance shaft 3.8-liter V6. And even though this was the so-called even firing design with the staggered crank pins, it still shook a little bit. It wasn't that great of an engine. And at this point, these engines weren't the 300, 400,000 mile engines that they were when it became the 3800. It would probably last 140,000 miles or so before you'd start getting some lower end issues. Not bad, but not great, I would say, either. Not as durable as the 3800 engine was. Regardless, like I said, this was a standard engine. Optional was the Olds 307 5-liter V8. Made 140 horsepower, I think 255 pound-feet of torque. Much smoother, very smooth, very quiet engine. Not overly powerful, but very smooth and quiet. And then there was the top option, the turbo 3.8-liter engine, made 245 horsepower and 355 pound-feet of torque. So going from the naturally aspirated 3.8 that made 110 horsepower, 190 pound-feet, if you got the turbo, you got 245 horsepower, over 100% increase in horsepower, and 355 pound-feet of torque versus 190. Not quite 100% increase there, maybe 80-ish% increase. So the turbo really, really boosted the output of that 3.8-liter engine. But alas, this one just has the standard one, and I guess that's fine for the Limited and somebody who got a not that well-equipped Limited either. No power windows, no cruise control, standard engine. At least it has air conditioning and a lot of smog equipment. So what do you think of these last of the G bodies, in particular this Regal? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.